she was not expected. Not anymore. The house at Blackwater Hollow had stood silent for 13 years, shuttered, decaying, watched only by its ghosts. Then, without reason, a letter arrived. It was addressed in ink that had long faded, postmarked in a year that had already passed, and it was meant for her. Miss Jane Marple. 3 widows live inside the hollow now. Each claims innocence, each remembers differently, and each has buried a man. If you think you know how this ends, listen closely, because this story was never finished. It was interrupted. Before we turn the first page, answer me this. Would you open a letter, postmarked from the dead? Tell me in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. Turn on notification bell, so you won't miss our daily mystery. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackwater Hollow. It began, as many forgotten things do, with the arrival of a letter no one expected, and no one remembered sending. The envelope was cream-coloured, the kind that yellowed only slightly with time, and took ink like parchment. It sat among the ordinary papers in Miss Marple's letterbox, just behind the garden gate, that clicked on blustery mornings and shivered in the company of wind. But this envelope did not click, nor shiver. It waited, perfectly still, as though it had always belonged there, and had simply chosen that moment to be found. She noticed it only after brushing aside the week's ordinary trifles: a pamphlet for the church's spring tea sale, a thin catalogue from a wool company in Devon, and an advertisement for something she could not recall ordering. But beneath them, untouched and unsmudged, lay the envelope. It had no return address. The handwriting was unmistakably fine, a script that belonged to another era entirely. Long loops, careful curves, a particular flourish on the capital J of her name, as though the writer had known her not merely in acquaintance, but once in confidence. Miss Jane Marple. The ink had faded slightly at the edges, not from time or sun, but as if the letter had travelled somewhere cold before it had reached her. She held it in her hand longer than she meant to. It was heavier than it looked. It was only when she brought it inside, past the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway, and the warm scent of rose soap from the windowsill, that she noticed the date. March 14th, 1929. Not merely old, not merely late. This letter was dated exactly 3 years ago to the day, yet the postmark was last Tuesday, and the ink on the stamp was freshly pressed. She did not open it at once. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that old letters waited for reasons. Some waited to be read, some waited to be understood, and some, she feared, waited simply to remind the living that they had forgotten something they should not have. Eventually, she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of ivory paper, handwritten in the same elegant script. No heading, no introduction, no apology for the delay, just a brief message, 8 lines, and her name beneath it, Jane. If you are receiving this, it means the house is ready. There are matters that must be seen to. The truth has waited long enough. Please come to Blackwater Hollow. You will be received. Yours, L.B. It took her no more than 3 seconds to place the initials. Lady Beatrice Braithwaite, deceased, buried, in fact, for just over 2.5 years, her obituary marked with lilies and silence in the Times. A brief affair of a woman once admired in society, a widow twice over, remembered for her charities and her fondness for black tea over milk. But something now troubled Miss Marple. Lady Beatrice had been, if one remembered such things carefully, a person of order, of clarity, of precision. She did not forget things. She did not send letters dated 3 years ago, and she certainly did not invite guests to a manor she no longer inhabited, unless, of course, someone else had sent it, unless the invitation had never been meant for her at all. Blackwater Hollow. The name rang with a kind of dry finality, like an echo through the edge of memory. It had been the Braithwaite estate since long before the war, tucked in a crooked valley, 3 miles east of Lower Hemsby, past the old mill, where the road bent against the fog, and the hedgerows grew so thick they sometimes blocked the moonlight. It was a house known by few, and visited by fewer, a manor of green slate rooftops, iron drainpipes that clicked when it rained, and curtains that never moved from the upstairs windows. Miss Marple had been there once, and never again. The visit had been brief, an afternoon of strained smiles, and 2 sweet cake. The 3 widows of Blackwater Hollow, Lady Beatrice, Mrs. Edith Holloway, and Miss Vera Lang, had entertained her with all the elegance of mourning. It was a peculiar thing to see 3 women dressed in different shades of black, each with their own interpretation of loss. Lady Beatrice wore hers like silk armor. Edith clutched hers like a damp shroud. Vera, the youngest of the 3, wore black lace over pale skin, as if daring the color to touch her. Their husbands had died, separately, mysteriously, and in fairly quick succession, though no official inquiries had ever been raised. The conversation that day had been peculiar, too polite, as though something unsaid hovered between them. Miss Marple remembered leaving with the distinct feeling that the house itself had watched her go. Now, she was being asked to return. The journey was uneventful, if one ignored the cold. Though it was spring by calendar, the wind along the Hemsby Road held a bitterness that seemed to belong to another season. The taxi driver, a man who said little, and stared a touch too long at the envelope Miss Marple carried, dropped her 2 gates away from the manor, claiming the drive was too narrow for the car. She didn't argue. Blackwater Hollow stood at the edge of the low hill, surrounded on 3 sides by woods, and on the 4th by nothing at all, just open moor, flat and featureless, except for a single dead tree that leaned westward, like it had grown tired of standing properly. The manor was 3 stories high, with a roof that sagged at the corners, windows like watching eyes, and a bell that no longer rang but once had called servants from every corner of the estate. As she approached the gate, it opened. No one touched it, no one stood behind it. It simply swung inward, slowly, silently, and then stopped. Miss Marple walked through. The door of the house was already ajar. Inside, the entrance hall was precisely as she remembered it, long, dark, and lined with paintings of unsmiling men. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and hearth smoke, though the fireplace itself was cold. A long carpet ran from the door to the far wall, where a grandfather clock stood, unmoving, its face turned slightly askew. And then came the voices. 3, soft, layered, the sound of teacups being placed gently on porcelain saucers. They were in the drawing room. Lady Braithwaite sat nearest the window, wrapped in a shawl too thick for the mild afternoon, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked up, only once briefly, as Miss Marple entered, her eyes grey as ash, and almost entirely without recognition. Edith Holloway, beside the fire, poured tea with a slight tremor in her hands. She had always had that tremor. It was the sort that worsened when someone mentioned names, and Vera Lang, as pale and beautiful as Miss Marple remembered, smiled before Miss Marple even spoke. It was the sort of smile one reserved for secrets. None of them seemed surprised to see her. None of them acknowledged the letter. Miss Marple, ever the polite guest, removed her gloves. "Thank you for receiving me," she said calmly, her voice steady, her tone neither too curious nor too familiar. "Of course, Miss Marple," said Edith. "You were expected, were you not?" asked Vera. Miss Marple sat. The tea was warm, slightly bitter, and infused with something faintly floral, hibiscus perhaps, or something less common. There were no cakes. There was, however, a silence so delicate that even the clink of the teaspoon seemed to offend it. Lady Braithwaite broke it. "My dear Jane," she said, her voice fragile but clear, "I do hope you are not alarmed by the nature of the invitation." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "It was unexpected." Vera smiled again. Edith looked away. Lady Braithwaite continued, "Some things are better left late than never at all, don't you think?" The clock on the wall did not tick. There was a sound then, soft, almost inaudible, the sound of a door latching shut in another part of the house. Miss Marple said nothing. She was shown to her guest room by a silent maid, who walked 3 steps ahead, and never once turned back. The room was simple: white lace curtains, a brass bed with a patchwork quilt, a small writing desk, and a mirror that faced the window instead of the bed. On the nightstand lay a book. It was not hers. She had not brought it. It was Selected Poems by Eleanor Marsh. The name rang oddly in her memory. She picked it up, turned the pages. A dried rose fell from between them. A note was tucked inside. "Do not ask them what happened. They will not say, but the house remembers, and the study is still locked. No signature, no handwriting, typed." She turned toward the window, drawn without knowing why, and for just a moment, no more, She thought she saw someone standing at the edge of the moor, a figure in black, veiled, motionless. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She would sleep lightly that night, though she would not remember why. The house creaked with a memory of footsteps. The wind tapped gently at the panes like it had been invited. The walls did not echo, but they held their breath, and somewhere, deep within the floorboards, something made the faintest sound, like the turning of a page. If you've listened this far, the house thanks you, but it also asks, do you see what it's hiding? If you think you've caught the first clue, share it in the comments, and subscribe to stay with Miss Marple until the final chapter is read. After all, it was you she invited too. Chapter 2. Tea. Among the widows. The sun, if it had ever risen, remained cloaked behind a gauze of clouds that hung over the house like an old curtain, unmoved, unwashed, and content to dull whatever warmth might have crept through the windows. It was a house, not of gloom, but of stillness. The kind of stillness that existed not because all was well, but because too much had gone unspoken for far too long. Miss Marple awoke early, as she always did, though she had not truly slept. The sort of sleep one experiences in a place like Blackwater Hollow was not rest, it was waiting, a silent bargain with the house that if she closed her eyes, it would not speak to her in dreams. She had heard sounds, faint and measured, from within the walls, a soft tap, a distant clink, the deliberate rustle of fabric when no one else stirred, and yet, when she opened her eyes, nothing had moved, nothing had entered, and nothing had been placed, except for a single withering petal from the dried rose that had fallen from Eleanor Marsh's poetry. It now lay beside the book on her nightstand, like a pressed whisper. She dressed carefully, deliberately. In such places, one did not rush. She chose a soft navy wool, with white trim, and her brooch of small pearls, a gift once given, long ago, by a woman whose name now escaped her, though the sentiment remained intact. She pinned it just below her collar, and glanced once in the mirror, not out of vanity, but in habit, and not without an odd moment of pause. For while her own reflection returned her gaze, she noticed something else entirely in the room behind her, the faintest indentation on the far edge of her bed, as though someone had been seated there, or still was. She did not look again, not just yet. Instead, she opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The house greeted her with nothing, no sound, no scent, not even the familiar creak of floorboards underfoot. The rug along the hallway muffled everything but thought, and thoughts, in Blackwater Hollow, had a way of echoing long after they should have faded. She made her way down the main stairwell, its banister, carved with thorned vines, and initials, so old their origin, had likely been lost, even to those who lived there now. The house was the kind that remembered things, even when its occupants preferred to forget. The scent of rosewater still lingered faintly in the air, not the kind kept in bottles, but the kind that had long since seeped into the very grain of the wood. The drawing room waited, with its lace curtains and narrow windows that always seemed just slightly too tall for their frames. Inside were the widows, precisely where she expected them to be, each occupying the same seat as the day before, as if they had never moved, not even for sleep. Lady Braithwaite sat beneath the window, her shawl darker today, with a brooch of obsidian shaped like a raven's wing. Her expression, if it could be called that, was neutral, the kind worn by those who had long since traded emotion for protocol. Her hands were gloved once more, though she had not worn gloves yesterday. Miss Marple noticed, but said nothing. Edith Holloway clutched a teacup in both hands, as though for warmth or reassurance. Her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's, but darted instead to a framed photograph on the mantel, 3 men, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a rose garden. The fourth corner of the photo had been burned away, and Vera Lang, ever the pale rose with thorns turned inward, wore a faint smile that had not changed since the last century. She looked up at Miss Marple, as though they were meeting for tea after church, not as if they were reunited in a house that no longer made sense. "Good morning," Miss Marple offered politely. "You're just in time," said Vera. Edith was about to ask about the garden, weren't you, darling?" Edith said nothing, though her grip on the teacup tightened just enough to make it tremble. Lady Braithwaite gestured to the empty chair, the same one Miss Marple had occupied the day before. It had already been set. Tea poured, biscuit untouched, napkin folded. The plate was china, pale blue with silver trim, one of a matched set. The detail did not escape her. "Is there anything in particular I'm in time for?" she asked lightly, taking her seat. Lady Braithwaite replied with an almost imperceptible nod. "For tea, of course," she said. "We always take tea at 10. It keeps the day familiar." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, stirring hers once, twice, then setting the spoon precisely on the saucer's edge. She did not drink, not yet. "I must thank you," she said after a moment, "for the invitation. It's not often I receive correspondence from beyond the ordinary." Edith looked down at her cup. Vera's smile did not falter. Lady Braithwaite blinked slowly. "We didn't send it," said Edith, so softly it was barely a sound. Miss Marple tilted her head gently, as though considering a painting. "Ah," she said, "then it seems it sent itself." The pause that followed was not silence. It was the careful consideration of what could be admitted without consequence. Vera spoke next. "Well, someone clearly wanted you here, Miss Marple. The house doesn't open its doors for just anyone." That turn of phrase, "the house opens its doors," carried more weight than it should have. Miss Marple filed it away. "I was surprised to find the gate unlocked," she said. "In fact, it opened as I approached. So did the front door. I assumed I was expected." "You were," said Lady Braithwaite. "But not by us," added Edith, her voice returning, brittle but steady. Vera took a sip of her tea and set the cup down with care. "It's odd, isn't it," she said, "how some houses develop habits." "Houses do tend to remember things," Miss Marple said, "especially the things people try to forget." She allowed the words to settle. They did not take long to land. Vera's gaze remained fixed, as if amused. Lady Braithwaite said nothing, and Edith, without warning, rose from her seat. "I'll fetch the biscuits," she said, though there were already 3 varieties on the table. She left the room without looking at any of them. Miss Marple waited until the soft clack of her shoes had faded. She turned gently to Lady Braithwaite. "Forgive me," she said, "but I find myself curious. You say you did not send for me, and yet I am here, being served tea, with my name already on the guest list. What exactly am I to make of that?" Lady Braithwaite's expression did not change. "I imagine," she said carefully, "that the house has its own reasons. And you are a woman who listens when a house speaks." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "That I do." Edith returned a few moments later, carrying nothing. She resumed her seat, as if the absence of biscuits were not worthy of mention. No one commented. The room grew quiet again. The clock, still unmoving. The fireplace, dark. And yet a warmth began to gather, not from the hearth, but from the strange realization that Miss Marple was not merely a guest, but perhaps something more, an audience, or a witness, or perhaps the only one willing to ask the question everyone else had buried. She set her teacup down. "I was given a book in my room," she said. At this Vera finally blinked. "Oh," she said lightly, "do tell." "Selected poems," Miss Marple said. "By Eleanor Marsh." There it was, the flicker. The brief involuntary reaction across all 3 faces, not shock, not recognition, something in between. Like hearing the name of a ghost and suddenly realizing you had never spoken it aloud before. Edith cleared her throat, but said nothing. Vera's smile vanished for just a second, then returned, thinner. Lady Braithwaite's eyes drifted toward the window, as though watching for something. "Such a tragic girl," said Vera, almost as an afterthought. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Tragic. She went missing," Edith murmured. "Years ago, no one ever found her, just disappeared." "In this house?" Miss Marple asked. Lady Braithwaite's voice emerged, low and final. "She was never officially here." The phrasing was deliberate. "Then why her book?" Miss Marple asked gently. No one replied, and for a moment, it felt as though even the house had leaned in. She rose from her chair slowly, smoothing the front of her skirt with one hand. "If I may," she said, "I should like to visit the garden." Vera stood as well. "I'll show you the way." Lady Braithwaite did not move. Edith stared once more at the photograph. Miss Marple followed Vera through the narrow corridor, past the library with the locked cabinet, the music room with its silent piano, and the small alcove where a vase of dried lilies sat untouched. Every wall held a story, and every doorknob hesitated before turning. The garden door opened stiffly. Outside, the air was crisp but not cold. The rose bushes had long since overgrown their boundaries, curling against the wrought iron trellis like dancers who had forgotten their partners. The paths were uneven, some stones cracked, others shifted, as if rearranged not by weather but by choice. Vera walked ahead, her hand brushing a bush whose thorns had turned inward. "She used to sit there," she said suddenly, nodding toward a bench beneath a dead tree. "Eleanor," Vera nodded. "She liked poems about grief, said they made her feel alive." "And how did she come to be associated with Blackwater Hollow?" Miss Marple asked. "She was once engaged to one of the husbands," Vera replied, a note of something almost tender in her voice. "But she never married." "Which one?" Vera did not answer. They returned in silence. Back inside, the hallway smelled faintly of burnt tea and lavender. A faint creak came from above. Miss Marple paused. "Who else is in the house?" Vera turned slowly. "No one." And yet, as they climbed the stairs back to their rooms, a shadow moved across the landing. It did not stop. It did not glance back. It simply disappeared into the study, the room no one had yet mentioned, and no one dared enter. Miss Marple turned to Vera. "Is it still locked?" Vera said nothing. She didn't need to, because the sound that came next was not of silence. It was the faint, unmistakable click of a typewriter key. Only once. Only one letter, but the letter had already been pressed. Chapter 3. It was the quiet that returned first. Not the kind that soothes or settles, but the sort that stretches, long and thin, like a shadow at dusk, pulling over the corridors and furniture of Blackwater Hollow as if to tuck the house into itself. The sound Miss Marple had heard, a typewriter key, deliberate and unmistakable, had not repeated. It did not need to. The silence that followed was far louder, far stranger, and far more convincing than any echo. She had not spoken of it. When she and Vera returned from the garden, there had been no mention of footsteps on the landing, no glance exchanged between the other widows, and no reaction that might have betrayed even the faintest curiosity about the sound. It was, as so many things in the house were, acknowledged in absence, present by the sheer effort with which it was ignored. And so, Miss Marple said nothing. She allowed the afternoon to recede behind drawn curtains, and polite conversation permitted the evening to unfurl itself across the dining room table in the form of soup that tasted faintly of nutmeg and silence, and let the night come without remark as the candles in the chandelier dripped slow wax into crystal trays that had not been polished since the war. It was not detachment. It was calculation. There were things that needed to be noticed before they were mentioned. Later, in her guest room, she placed Eleanor Marsh's poetry back inside the desk drawer. She did not open it this time. The rose petal had curled brown at the edges and left the faintest imprint on the page it had rested upon, a smudge in the shape of a falling feather. There was nothing remarkable about the book. That was the most remarkable thing about it. The bed was as it had been the night before, sheets tucked, pillow smooth, quilt folded at the foot, and yet, as she sat on its edge and removed her shoes, she felt it again, that faint suggestion that someone had occupied it earlier. Not a dent, not a crease. Just a sense, no more explainable than the scent of something floral, long since faded, that lingered in the air without origin. She turned the lamp low and prepared for sleep, though she knew better than to expect it. The house did not sleep, it simply waited, and when the waiting became too much, it would stir. It happened sometime between the second and third hour, after the grandfather clock had decided to strike only once, and then reconsider, and before the wind outside had shifted just enough to stir the curtain lace beside the window. The sound was not loud, but precise. Not mechanical, but deliberate. A single click, followed by another, the unmistakable rhythm of keys being pressed, one after the other, with the kind of patience that did not seek speed, but certainty. A typewriter. Somewhere beyond her door, behind it, in fact. Miss Marple sat up slowly, not startled, but sure. She reached for her robe, wrapped it tightly around her, and listened. The sound came again. 4 keys now, followed by a pause, a longer pause. Then 2 more, then silence. She waited. No footsteps, no movement, only stillness, and the kind of stillness that seemed far too deliberate to be empty. She stepped into the corridor. The air outside her door was cooler than before, the draft more insistent. The candle sconce at the far end had extinguished, though the window beside it remained latched. She turned left. 3 doors down, at the end of the hallway, stood the study. Lord Braithwaite's study, unopened, untouched, unforgotten. It was exactly as it had always been, a wide wooden door with an iron handle and an old-fashioned keyhole set within a frame that had once been painted hunter green, but now stood flaked and faded, as though its color had tried too hard to remain. She approached, slowly, without sound. The door was shut, the sound of the typewriter had stopped. There was nothing now, only the door itself, and the memory of what she had heard behind it. She turned the handle, locked, not stiffly, not rusted, but freshly locked. She knelt, glanced through the keyhole. Nothing, only darkness. The kind that wasn't empty, but purposeful. She rose, adjusted her robe, and returned to her room. Sleep did not find her again. It lingered, just out of reach, like a page left half-turned in a story, whose ending refused to arrive. The morning brought with it a sky, the color of unpolished silver, and a breakfast tray left without sound beside her door. No knock, no call, just the tray, and the suggestion that someone had been there, quietly, confidently, and unseen. She lifted the linen napkin from the cup. There, inside the teacup, lay a key. Small, brass, unmarked. It was not her key, and it was certainly not part of the house's ordinary set. She examined it carefully. No inscription, no tag, only a faint smudge on the handle, as though it had recently been held by fingers too cold or too uncertain to press fully. She did not drink the tea. She did not eat the toast. Instead, she placed the key in her dressing gown pocket and dressed for the day, with the quiet deliberateness of a woman preparing not for breakfast, but for a question. The drawing room, once again, held the 3 widows in precisely the same configuration. It was a tableau now, something between habit and ritual. Vera, already seated, glanced up and smiled faintly. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Fitfully," said Miss Marple. Edith sipped her tea with hands that trembled slightly more than the day before. Lady Braithwaite did not respond. Her gaze was fixed on a spot just above the fireplace. There was nothing there, but she seemed to be watching for something. Miss Marple took her seat. The conversation, if it could be called that, consisted of pleasantries that masked precision, recollections that masked deflection, and smiles that were just slightly too rehearsed to be remembered naturally. At no point did anyone mention a key. At no point did anyone mention the study. And so, Miss Marple did not mention them either. Not yet. She finished her tea, untouched toast, still warm beside her, and rose. "I think I'll take a moment to write a letter," she said. Lady Braithwaite gave a nod that was not quite agreement, but not refusal. Vera sipped her tea. Edith said nothing. Back in her room, she took out the key. It was of course the obvious assumption that it belonged to the study. She crossed the hallway once more, this time with her footsteps silent on the carpet, her breathing measured, her hand steady. She placed the key in the lock, turned. It did not resist. But it did not open, not stuck, not jammed, just wrong. The key did not belong to the study. She held it in her hand a moment longer. The weight of it felt too deliberate to be meaningless. She turned, walked back to her room, and closed the door behind her. She stood in the center of the room, let her gaze move slowly from one corner to another, desk, window, bookcase, mirror, bed, and then the nightstand. The drawer. She moved to it, placed the key into the lock. It turned. With a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside lay a small envelope, and a page. Typed. Not handwritten. Just one sentence. They will not tell you where he is. But the drawer remembers. Below the page was a photograph. 3 women, 3 men, all standing beside a fountain, with rose petals floating on its surface. She recognized the widows immediately, though they looked younger, fuller, more certain. The men, though, were harder to place. One stood beside Lady Braithwaite, tall, upright, with eyes that gave nothing away. One sat with Vera, his hand barely grazing hers, and one further back, with Edith. Except, Miss Marple looked again. The photograph had been altered. The man beside Edith had no face. It had been scraped away, carefully, methodically, until only an outline remained. She looked at the envelope. It was blank. No name, no stamp, no seal, but inside, another key. This one older, iron, worn. She did not need to ask where it belonged. Not now. She turned toward the door, her fingers tightening slightly around the cold metal. The study waited. And the house was watching. Chapter 4. A Widow's Reflection. The drawer clicked shut, with the sound of something old, remembering how to move. Miss Marple stood still for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the brass handle, not for stability, but reflection. The contents it had revealed, the envelope, the photograph, the typewritten note, had not surprised her. And that was perhaps the most troubling thing. One did not find photographs with faces missing and feel comfort in the discovery, unless the discomfort had already taken root, long before. The scratched image was precise, not random, not an accident of time or wear. The line of removal had been etched by a hand both meticulous and determined, its pressure careful, its intent unmistakable. Whoever had done this had known exactly which man to erase, and had done so not with haste or rage, but with purpose. It was not an erasure of memory. It was a refusal of recognition. 3 husbands had lived in this house once, alongside the 3 widows, who now sat as shadows of themselves in parlors that never changed temperature, and in conversations that always ran too smoothly to be honest. In the photograph, 2 of those men stood clearly. Lord Braithwaite, tall and narrow of face, his right hand resting near the fountain's base, and the other younger, with a confident slant to his shoulders, and a half-smile that hinted at charm, learned through careful observation, rather than natural ease. The third man, his form intact, his presence visible, had only the face removed, as though his identity, not his body, had been the true offence. Miss Marple held the photograph up to the window's grey morning light, her eyes narrowing slightly. The outline of the erased face revealed just enough, a parting of the hair, perhaps the faintest curve of a cheekbone left untouched. Not enough to place him, just enough to feel the absence. She turned the photo over. No writing, no date, and yet it was older than anything else she had seen in the house so far. Older, even than the typed messages, and far older than the denial that had grown around it. She tucked the photograph into her notebook, slid the key back into her pocket, and straightened the brooch at her collar with the sort of mechanical grace that only came to those who had spent their lives thinking clearly in places where clarity was no longer welcome. Downstairs, the house breathed around her. That was the word that came to her most frequently now. Breathed. It was not creaking, not settling, not shifting, breathing, quietly, like it waited, not for discovery, but confession. She passed the long mirror in the corridor on her way to the drawing room. The glass had tarnished at the edges, as all old mirrors do, its silver backing beginning to separate into veins of shadow. Her reflection moved with her, as it should, and yet she slowed all the same. There was something odd in the angle of her own face as she turned, something slightly off about the way the light played behind her shoulders. She stopped, looked again. Her reflection was correct, but the shadows behind her, no. She would come back to that. In the drawing room, only 2 of the widows were seated, Vera and Lady Braithwaite. Edith's chair was empty, its teacup untouched. "She isn't well this morning," Vera said lightly, not looking up from her embroidery. Miss Marple nodded once. Has she taken to bed? She's always in bed, Vera replied, a needle slipping through crimson thread, like blood through gauze. Even when she isn't. Lady Braithwaite said nothing. Miss Marple took her seat without ceremony. The tea was already poured. The biscuit tray was absent again. After a moment, Miss Marple set the photograph on the edge of the table, angled just so. Vera's needle stopped. Lady Braithwaite blinked slowly. She kept it then, Vera murmured, her voice barely audible. Did she? Miss Marple asked. Vera returned to her work. It was hers, once. Lady Braithwaite's eyes remained on the fire, which hadn't been lit in 2 days. You'll find Edith in the east guest chamber, she said finally. It was not permission, nor was it dismissal, it was expectation. The hallway to the east guest rooms had always felt narrower than the others. It was not in the measurements, but in the light, or the lack thereof. The windows along that side of the house had been fitted with heavier curtains decades ago, and though they opened easily, no one ever seemed to open them fully. The effect was a corridor of filtered grey, broken only by 3 doors, and a long wall mirror, framed in black oak. Miss Marple passed the first door, empty, the second, locked, the third, Edith's. She knocked gently, no reply. She knocked again, still nothing. She opened the door. The room smelled faintly of lavender and starch. Edith lay in the bed, propped up by 2 pillows, her face pale, her eyes half closed. She turned slowly as Miss Marple entered, her lips forming the faintest suggestion of a frown. I didn't call for anyone, she said. No, Miss Marple replied, but I have something that might interest you. She moved to the window, opened the curtain just enough to permit a slant of natural light, and placed the photograph on the edge of the nightstand. Edith looked at it for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was flat. Where did you find that? In my drawer, Miss Marple replied, with a message that said the drawer remembers. Edith's fingers curled against the blanket. I burned that photograph. Clearly not. I scratched it out. Yes. He shouldn't be remembered. Miss Marple took a slow seat in the chair beside the bed. You've told people your husband died abroad, she said gently. He did. Alone. Yes. And yet here he is, in this house, standing beside Lord Braithwaite, near the fountain. Edith closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Photos lie. No. People do. There was a long pause. Edith opened her eyes again. I was never supposed to marry him, she said. It was an arrangement. He was charming. To everyone but me. Did he come to Blackwater Hollow often? He lived here, for 3 years. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Then he didn't die abroad. Edith looked away. I said what needed to be said. You said what protected someone. The silence that followed was not resistance. It was agreement unspoken. Miss Marple rose, left the photograph where it lay, and exited the room without waiting for dismissal. She walked slowly back down the corridor, and as she passed the long wall mirror, the one framed in black oak, she noticed again something wrong. Her reflection walked beside her, but it lagged, just slightly, half a step, then suddenly, in perfect sync, then again, just behind. She stopped. The reflection stopped. She turned toward it. In the mirror, she stood alone, then blinked, and saw herself again, but this time, not alone. There was someone behind her, a figure, not fully formed, not in focus, but there. She turned sharply. No one. The corridor behind her was empty, but the mirror, held on to what it had seen, even after the world had tried to forget. Chapter 5. The Fourth Widow. It had rained in the night, softly, not enough to flood or stain, but enough to leave the ground wet, and unwilling, the stones of the estate path darkened like bruises beneath a silk glove. Miss Marple had awakened early, as she always did, but not in the usual manner. She hadn't opened her eyes first. Instead, she had stirred with a sensation like the faintest impression of something once warm, now absent, having sat beside her bed for longer than was polite. There was no sound, no mark left on the rug, no creak in the floorboards, just the aftermath of something invisible rising and leaving before being caught. She dressed slowly, not with suspicion, but with intent, because the air in Blackwater Hollow was not the same. It had changed, again. There had been whispers of rot in the garden. Vera had mentioned it casually at breakfast the morning prior, complaining that the chrysanthemums had soured too early, that the soil must be turning on itself, and that it was rather poetic in its own way, if one looked at it long enough. Lady Braithwaite, of course, had not responded, merely watching the flames in the hearth, as though the fire itself were whispering something more worth hearing. And Edith had not come down at all. Whether it was illness or memory that kept her upstairs, no one asked. Perhaps they already knew. And so, on this morning, one both grey and quietly expectant, Miss Marple requested a walk, not from the widow's, but from the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Broom, who had emerged from the cellar corridor with hands dusted in flour and a look that hovered between suspicion and obligation. The woman had been with the house, off and on, for 27 years, though no one ever said where she went in the years between. She agreed with a nod, handed Miss Marple a folded shawl, and gestured toward the front garden path, as if to say, "Take care not to wander where the map ends." Miss Marple did not wander. She walked deliberately, past the sunken rose beds and the cracked sundial that always pointed north, regardless of where the sun truly was. The trees in the outer hedgerow leaned more than they had the week before, as if listening, or perhaps bending to avoid saying what they had seen. And just beyond the iron gate that marked the old property boundary, the path curved downward into the village. It was there, at the edge of the post office, beside a telephone box that hadn't worked since 1982, and a hanging basket of ivy that refused to die, that Miss Marple found the first real interruption in the day. A voice. "I wouldn't linger too long in that house, miss. Not if you've got anything left to love." It came from a man, not young, not old, who stood with a dog that didn't bark, his jacket damp at the cuffs and his hands buried deep in his pockets. He didn't look directly at her, only down the road, as if seeing something beyond it. "I'm merely a guest," Miss Marple replied. He nodded once, but the movement was more an echo than a gesture. They always are, at first. She tilted her head slightly. "You've known the house a long time." "My brother was the groundskeeper," he said, "before the war, before all the doors stopped shutting right, and before the fourth widow." That, of course, was the moment. The line that didn't belong in any ordinary conversation. The phrase that asked to be unpacked, yet sat there like a sealed suitcase no one dared open. "Fourth," she said. He nodded, slower this time. There were 4 of them, years back. Before she vanished. Before her husband was found. Vanished. Eleanor Marsh, pretty thing. Liked poems. Didn't like people. I've heard her name. You won't hear it from them. He turned his head now, met her eyes. Because the house was different after she left. It was never meant for 4, but it punished them just the same. And her husband. He hesitated, just slightly. They said he left. Truth was, he never did. Found him bricked up behind the study wall, like a time capsule. Only rotted. Miss Marple didn't blink. She waited. Police blamed her, said she lost her mind. That she'd done it, and run. But I saw her a week after they found him. Where? Standing at the back gate, wearing white, holding a wedding ring. She didn't speak, just looked right through me, like I was already gone. Then she turned, and she walked back inside. He paused, and no one's seen her since. Miss Marple nodded once, quietly. What was her husband's name? Thomas Marsh. The man's dog barked once, sharply, as if something had just stepped where it shouldn't. She turned. There was no one behind her. But the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. She thanked the man, who nodded as if she hadn't spoken, and began walking again. This time, not back toward the house, but around it, along the perimeter path that looped behind the southern greenhouse and the unused garden maze. It was there that the architecture of the house shifted, ever so subtly. Where the brickwork changed, where one window didn't match the others, where the ivy grew thicker than it should have, as though it had something to protect. She stood there a moment, hands tucked neatly in front of her, and looked up. The study window. No curtains, no movement, but inside, just for a moment, she thought she saw a chair rock gently backward, as if someone had just stood up, or stepped away. She returned inside, removing her shawl, placing it neatly over the banister at the base of the stairs, and climbed with the patience of someone not following a trail, but anticipating where it would reappear. The east corridor was dimmer than before, and in the glass of the long mirror, she saw herself again. Alone, but only for a moment, because the moment she passed it fully, she caught it, her own reflection turning its head a second too late. Not much, not exaggerated, but off. Just enough to confirm that whatever inhabited the mirrors in Blackwater Hollow wasn't entirely satisfied with reflection alone. She made her way to the drawing room. All three widows were there now, though Edith's eyes were shadowed with fatigue, and Vera's embroidery had turned into something shapeless and abstract, the thread trailing loose like veins. Lady Braithwaite, as always, looked toward the fireplace, unlit as ever, with the kind of stillness that suggested she was waiting for something specific to emerge from it. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her voice perfectly pleasant. "It's afternoon," Vera replied. "Is it? Barely. I've just come from the village," Miss Marple said lightly. No response. "I spoke to a gentleman who used to work here," still no response. "He remembers a fourth widow." This time, the silence changed, not in sound, but in shape, as though the very air around them stiffened. "I believe her name was Eleanor Marsh." Vera's eyes didn't blink. Edith stirred, but said nothing. Lady Braithwaite's voice came at last, low and deliberate. "We do not speak of the unwed." "Unwed," Miss Marple repeated. "But she was married to Thomas Marsh." "She was married by word," said Lady Braithwaite, her lips thin. "But not by law. There was no record, no church, no recognition. He lived here, yes, but she was unofficial." "That's a curious phrase." "It's an accurate one." "Is that why she disappeared?" "She left," Vera said suddenly. "That's all. She was never bricked into anything." "I never said she was." More silence. Then Vera rose, slowly, as though her legs were remembering how to support her. "She used to write letters," she said, "even when no one wrote back. I found one once, in the greenhouse." Said she heard him in the walls. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Him? The man she never married?" Lady Braithwaite stood now as well. "This conversation is over. Perhaps for you," Miss Marple said. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. End of part 1. Miss Marple left the drawing room without being dismissed. Not rudely, not hurriedly, but with the same quiet authority she had employed countless times before, whether in drawing rooms, parlors, or gardens, where truths hung in the air like mist, waiting for someone brave enough to breathe them in. She returned to her guest room, and closed the door softly behind her. Not to retreat, but to consider. The name Eleanor Marsh had echoed through the morning, like a tune remembered just out of reach. It wasn't only the woman's disappearance that intrigued her, it was how utterly the household had attempted to erase her. Even the denial felt manufactured. Neat. Too neat. She turned toward the desk, and looked at the drawer again, still empty. The photograph remained in her notebook, tucked away carefully, but the message that had come with it now rang louder in her mind than before. "They will not tell you where he is, but the drawer remembers," a drawer that had opened for her, and no one else. She reached toward her pillow, now, not from suspicion, but habit. The kind of routine one falls into in unfamiliar places, and yet, as her fingers touched the pillow's seam, they paused. Something was inside. Not large, not sharp, not immediately threatening, but there. She turned the pillow gently, slid her hand beneath the fabric, and pulled something cold into her palm. A ring. Simple, elegant, worn, and inside, faintly engraved, were 2 letters, E.M. She stared at it for a long time, and for the first time since she had entered Blackwater Hollow, she felt it. Not fear, not confusion, but certainty. Eleanor Marsh had not left this house. She had not been erased. She had simply moved to a place no one else dared to see. Because the silence wasn't empty. It was watching, and it had just handed her a ring. Chapter 6. The Widow's Game. There were many ways a person could be remembered. Some were etched in photographs, faded and torn by time. Others whispered through attic trunks or half-burned letters left beneath floorboards. But the most haunting were those who had never left at all, who lingered, not in body, but in routine, in corners, untouched by dust, in hallways where footsteps still hesitated out of habit. Eleanor Marsh, it seemed, was one such presence. Miss Marple held the wedding ring in her palm for several minutes without moving. She had not placed it in her pillowcase. Of that she was certain. The maid had not been in. Her things had not been disturbed, except for this, small, quiet, deliberate. There was no note, no sound in the hall, no whisper behind the walls, only the metal, still faintly warm, as though it had not rested there long, and engraved within, barely legible, EM. It was too intimate to be planted, too personal to be ignored. She set the ring on the nightstand, took a moment to smooth the sheets, an act that felt like sealing a letter one was not ready to send, and crossed to the window. Rain had begun again, a silent mist clinging to the edges of the glass, like breath held too long. The garden beyond was unchanged, yet different. The hedges seemed closer, the pond darker, the greenhouse glass too clouded to see through. Downstairs, she would ask nothing. She would watch, and then she would go beyond the house itself, because sometimes the answers were not in the drawing room, but in the places the widows no longer mentioned. She left mid-morning with a shawl and a book she didn't intend to read. Her steps carried her not into the village this time, but farther down a side path that curved behind the house, beyond the ancient well, past the neglected orchard. Here the trees grew more wildly, their branches less pruned, as if untouched by the gardeners who favoured symmetry and silence. In this overgrown section, tucked beside a half-collapsed fence and behind ivy-covered trellis gates, lay the remnants of what had once been a croquet court, a space now overtaken by weeds, its mallets long gone, its boundaries forgotten. But here, too, stood something else, a stone bench, and beside it, set with quiet precision into the earth, was a memorial marker, the text worn, barely readable, but Miss Marple crouched gently and traced the weathered letters with her gloved fingertips. For those who left, and those who stayed behind. No name, no date, just that. It was a message, not to the living, but to the ones who had vanished. She sat on the bench for several minutes, letting the wind tell her what it remembered. Somewhere behind her, a bird called out once, sharply, then fell silent, as if correcting itself. She rose, adjusted her scarf, and began walking again, this time toward the East Lane, where the village records office stood inside what had once been a grain store. Few visited it anymore. Most of the names in its ledgers belonged to families long faded or buried without plaque. But Miss Marple was not here for the common names. She was here for the ones they had tried to forget. The clerk was an elderly man, with hair too neatly parted, and a cardigan that looked more moth than wool. He did not ask her purpose. He simply gestured to the ledger shelves and returned to polishing a brass magnifier on his desk. She worked through 3 volumes before she found it. Marsh, Thomas, deceased, 1952. Body discovered during renovation of Blackwater Hollow West Wing. No cause listed, no charges filed, case closed. And beneath that, a secondary entry, Marsh, Eleanor, status, unconfirmed. Presumed relocated, no formal record of burial. Marriage license, none found. Miss Marple stared at the page. Then she copied the details onto a page in her notebook, not because she would forget them, but because writing something gave it form, a kind of permission to matter again. And as she closed the book, she felt it, faint but certain, that she was no longer the only person reading. The clerk remained still, but something behind her had shifted, and as she turned, slowly, cautiously, she caught her own reflection in the glass of the framed village map on the wall. Except, she wasn't alone. A woman stood behind her, too blurred to see clearly, but present. She turned. No one. Only shelves. Only dust. Only quiet. But the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. When she returned to the manor, dusk had begun to settle, not in dramatic orange or crimson, but in the kind of grey that makes outlines soft, and the familiar, unfamiliar. The lamps had been lit in the hallway, casting golden pools of warmth that did little to chase the cold from the air. She passed Vera in the hall. The younger widow looked up from a small notebook, snapped it shut, and smiled. "I always forget how quickly the day fades in October," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Do you write often?" she asked. "Letters mostly, to no one. Those are the most honest kind." Vera hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the drawing room. Edith was seated at the piano when Miss Marple entered, though she wasn't playing. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, unmoving, like a memory, afraid to breathe. And Lady Braithwaite was once again staring at the fire, unlit, as always. Miss Marple didn't speak. She walked to the hearth, knelt slowly, and struck a match. The flame caught on the wood instantly, crackling louder than seemed reasonable. The heat rose fast, too fast, and for a moment, she thought she heard something behind the flames, not a voice, but a breath, like someone gasping in surprise, or in return. The room stilled. Lady Braithwaite stood, and then, without speaking, left the room. Edith followed. Only Vera remained, seated in the corner, her hands clasped. "You shouldn't light that," she said. "Why?" "It doesn't like fire." Miss Marple turned. "What doesn't?" Vera looked toward the ceiling, the part of the house that remembers her. "She's still here, isn't she?" "Of course she is. Why else would the mirrors lie?" Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. But she knew now, without question, that Eleanor Marsh had been bricked out of history, not to punish her, but to protect someone else. And behind that protection was a game, one still being played, with stakes no one had yet named. And at that moment, if you followed Miss Marple this far, perhaps you see what she sees. A puzzle not solved with evidence or confession, but presence, silence, memory. If you enjoy mysteries that unfold gently, where tension lives in the quiet, between footsteps, or in the way a mirror doesn't quite reflect what it should, then subscribe, because the story only deepens from here, and the final move is yet to come. Upstairs, Miss Marple's room was exactly as she had left it, except for one detail. The pillow had been turned, not fluffed, not remade, just turned, and beneath it, the ring was gone, not misplaced, not fallen, gone. She didn't search for it. She didn't need to. It had been taken, retrieved perhaps, by the one who had left it as a message, or reclaimed by something less explainable, more ancient, buried in the fabric of Blackwater Hollow, because the house did not give freely. It only loaned, and it always wanted something in return. She sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the notebook again. This time, she did not write. She removed the photograph, held it in the candlelight. Still two faces visible, still one scratched out, but now, something had changed. The scratch marks had shifted. What had once been a single gouged face was now two. Lord Braithwaite's face, faded at the edges, as though time, or intent, was beginning to erase him too. Miss Marple set the photograph down slowly, and listened. There it was again. The faint sound of footsteps above her room, where there was no staircase, no guest chamber, no hall, only the attic, and above that, only the roof. She moved to the door, and opened it quietly. The corridor was dark. The mirror waited. She approached it cautiously, eyes forward, and in its surface, she saw herself, alone, until she wasn't. Because from the edge of the reflection, someone stepped into view, not toward her, not threatening, just watching. A figure in white, holding something in their hand. A ring. The same one. And then, just as she reached out to the glass, the image vanished. Her hand met cold, smooth surface. Nothing more. The mirror had returned to its usual deception, but behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. That night, she dreamed of Eleanor Marsh, not as a ghost, but as a woman left behind by time, standing in a forgotten corridor of the house, humming a lullaby no one remembered, her voice echoing faintly through walls that should not carry sound. And in the dream, Eleanor said, "Just one thing. They never played fair, but I never lost." Miss Marple awoke in the darkness, heart steady, breath calm. She turned her pillow over. Nothing. But beneath the bed, a faint glint. She reached down, slowly, and lifted a folded piece of paper. One line, typed. "The next move is yours." She looked toward the mirror. It said nothing, but it had already shown too much. Chapter 7. Whispers from the Study. There are moments when silence does not comfort but confess, when it settles not like peace, but like guilt draped in dust. And within that silence, something unspoken begins to surface, not in words, but in atmosphere. And so it was that Miss Marple stood in the hallway once more, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the study door, the very one that until now had refused all entry, not by lock or warning, but by time's own insistence. It had remained sealed since her arrival, a relic behind wood and air, but today, after so many shadows, dreams and revelations, the key slid into the lock with an ease too perfect to be coincidence, and it turned, with a click so soft, it was more suggestion than sound. She paused. The hallway behind her remained still. No footfalls, no breath, not even the ticking of the grandfather clock down the corridor dared interrupt. She opened the door. The study greeted her, not with the warmth of a long-lost room, but with the cold familiarity of something caught in a moment and never allowed to move again. Dust covered everything, spines of books sagging beneath its weight, the drapes hanging motionless in their faded grandeur, the rug beneath her feet, dull with age. And yet, in the center of the room, on a desk untouched by the decades, a typewriter sat gleaming, as if it had only been set down minutes ago. One sheet of paper was loaded, one line was typed. She came back. She knows. Miss Marple did not gasp, nor step back. She advanced, slowly, deliberately, like a reader nearing the final page of a novel that had until now kept its secrets too well. There was no dust on the typewriter, none on the paper, not even a faint ring of settled age on the desk where it sat. Everything else in the room had been forgotten. But this was prepared. She circled the desk once, her footsteps slow, careful not to disturb anything prematurely. A leather-bound chair, pulled out only slightly, stood before the desk, angled toward the window. The glass beyond the pane was fogged, not by temperature, but by age, a film of condensation trapped on the inside, undisturbed by hand or cloth. And beside the typewriter, placed without fanfare, was a book, not large, not ornate, but unmistakably chosen. A collection of poetry, pages worn from use. She did not need to open it to know that something inside was meant for her, but she did, and it fell open to a passage already bent at the spine. And when the rose no longer blooms, the garden whispers blame, for petals fall not just with age, but in betrayal's name. She stared at it for a long moment, then closed the book, because she understood. This wasn't about Eleanor Marsh alone. This was about what they had done to her, and what she had left behind. Behind the bookcase, somewhere deep within the walls, a sound stirred, not a creak, not a sigh. A voice, soft, coarse with distance, but clear. Turn the page. Miss Marple did not flinch, though her hand trembled, barely like a leaf deciding whether to fall. The voice hadn't echoed. It had nested, curled within the thick walls like breath held too long. She remained still for several seconds, listening not just to the sound but to the silence that followed it, because sometimes it was the pause after the whisper that said the most. And then she obeyed. Her fingers brushed the edge of the poetry book again, flipping the page with care one might give a confession. And there, written in neat, slanted ink, not type, but pen, was a verse not in print. A hand had added it, years ago, perhaps last night. The ink had bled faintly into the paper, as if the page itself resisted holding it. I was not the one who vanished. I was the one made to disappear. There was no name beneath it, no date, but the air in the room shifted, as though the room had just remembered something it had promised never to recall. Miss Marple closed the book again. She did not put it down. Instead, she circled to the shelves. Old wood, lacquer, dulled by decades, books lined them in perfect rows, but several stood taller than the others. She placed her hand along the spines, one by one, until she felt it. A dip in the shelf, a hollow. One of the books was not a book at all. She pressed, and the shelf clicked. It opened not outward, but slid to the left, like a sigh, pulled sideways. Behind it, darkness, not deep, not endless, but waiting, a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person. Miss Marple stared into it, and entered. Inside it was cooler. The air smelled of old paper, and something older still, lime and brick, and something that might have once been perfume. The walls narrowed, then widened, like a throat remembering how to swallow. She walked 3 paces, then 6, then 9, and found herself in a small chamber. No furniture, no window, no lamp, only a mirror, full length, set directly into the wall. It showed her clearly, but not alone. She moved left, so did the figure. She moved right, so did it. But behind her shoulder, just barely visible, stood something else, not fully formed, not shadow, not trick, but presence, watching. She turned sharply. Nothing. The room remained still. She faced the mirror again. This time, it was just her, but the air had thickened, the walls felt closer, and a faint sound like paper tearing very slowly emerged from somewhere behind the glass. Turn the page. Not spoken aloud, not heard with ears, but received. She stepped forward. Her hand met the mirror, cold, flat, unyielding. Yet inside, something shimmered. A second page, within the poetry book, still waited. She returned the way she came. The study greeted her like a room exhaling. She sat at the desk once more, and opened the book again. This time, the page was blank, except for one word, etched so lightly it barely disturbed the surface of the paper. Vera. She paused. Because until now, she had assumed Eleanor Marsh's torment had ended with her vanishing, but perhaps it had begun with betrayal. And Vera had been holding a needle, not just for embroidery, but for threading lies. Behind the walls, nothing stirred, but Miss Marple no longer needed confirmation. She had seen enough to know when guilt was embroidered between kindnesses. And still, there was more waiting. Because the game had not finished playing her yet, it had only just begun to tell its rules. And somewhere inside this house of 3 widows, perhaps not far from the room she now sat in, a story waited that had not yet reached its conclusion, one written in whispers, and waiting for the final page to turn. Chapter 8. Reflections and Red Herrings. By dawn, the house had already begun to rearrange itself, not in architecture, not in the layout of rooms or furniture, but in atmosphere, in feeling, in the small invisible adjustments that old buildings make when someone inside has finally begun to understand too much. It was as if the walls had grown watchful, as if the floorboards, having groaned so dutifully underfoot for decades, now braced themselves for a quiet attention. And somewhere above the east wing corridor, a mirror shifted minutely on its nail, not enough to fall, just enough to alter what it chose to reflect. Miss Marple had not slept, not fully. She had dozed for short intervals, her body yielding to rest, while her mind arranged fragments into shapes that almost, but not quite, resembled patterns. A ring that appeared and vanished, a typewriter that typed alone, a scratched photograph, a poetry book with pages that waited for her by name. And Vera, always Vera. She had spoken so little, smiled so often, yet something about the embroidery, threaded in patterns that grew less floral and more frantic, had begun to betray her. Not obviously, not in confession, but in rhythm. People hide themselves in the ways they repeat things, and Miss Marple had seen that kind of stitching before, once during the war, in a home where a mother pretended she hadn't lost a son. She had embroidered waves that never reached ashore. She had smiled too. Now Miss Marple, dressed and moved through the hallway as the first streak of grey light filtered across the stairwell. The house was silent, not sleeping, just waiting. In the drawing room, the fire had burned out entirely. Only the faint scent of smoke clung to the air like a warning. She paused beside the piano. It had not been played, yet the bench had moved slightly, as though someone had sat, prepared to begin, and then thought better of it. She turned to the window. Outside, the gardens lay damp, but not rain-soaked. Dew coated the hedges. The sundial remained defiantly incorrect, and from her vantage point, she could just make out a figure standing in the southern path, beneath the arbor of faded wisteria vines. It was Edith, alone. Still, Miss Marple made her way outside. The morning was colder than it looked. A thin mist threaded between the trees, catching at her ankles, curling around the stone steps like fingers unsure of their reach. When she approached Edith, the woman didn't startle, didn't turn. "She told you, didn't she?" Edith said quietly. "Who?" Edith's eyes stayed forward. "The one they won't name." Miss Marple stood beside her. "Not close, just enough." "She didn't tell me," she said gently. "But she's made herself heard." Edith nodded once. "Did you see her?" "In a way. She used to walk this path when she thought no one was watching. Always in the morning. Always alone. Until the last week. Then she started walking at night." Miss Marple waited. "She said the house didn't sleep." Edith continued. "That it whispered when we stopped listening. That the walls shifted when the fire went out." "Did you believe her?" "I was the only one who did. Vera." She laughed. "Lady Braithwaite." She forbade her from speaking of it. Said the house had no patience for ghosts. Miss Marple looked toward the manor. "And what did you say?" "I said I'd keep her secret." "I didn't know then what the secret was." She turned finally. "There's a room in the attic," Edith said. "Locked for years. It was hers once. Before the wedding. Before she was erased." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I'll need a key." Edith's expression did not change. But she reached into her coat pocket and handed something over, flat, tarnished, older than it should have been. "She told me to give it to the one who saw her. I think she meant you." Miss Marple nodded, and then, quietly, they walked back toward the house. Two women, both widowed by time in different ways, bound not by blood or memory, but by the knowledge that something inside Blackwater Hollow had waited far too long to be known again. The attic door was unlike the others in the house. It bore no embellishment, no polished brass, no attempt at elegance. It was plain, functional, narrow, more a barrier than a threshold. Yet it was the only door that had not groaned or resisted when Miss Marple slid the key into its rusted lock. Instead, it welcomed her with a soft metallic click, a quiet acknowledgement, as though the house, after much watching, had decided to allow the next move. She stepped into the narrow stairwell that twisted upward behind the linen closet. The stairs creaked, but not out of protest, more like they sighed beneath her, recognizing her as someone who had earned the right to walk here. The air grew cooler with each step, and the dust thickened, not just with age but with weight, emotional, not physical. Some corners of the house, after all, held memories the way cellars held damp, slow, invisible, and impossible to clean completely. At the top of the stairs, the attic opened into a narrow corridor, one that felt too long for the space it occupied, as though stretched by time itself. On either side, trunks stood like silent witnesses. The ceiling sloped low, the window at the far end had been boarded from outside, leaving only slatted light where glass should have been. But what caught her breath was the room at the end, the one with the door slightly ajar. She moved toward it slowly, her hand never touching the walls, and when she reached it, she pushed gently, not out of fear, but out of respect. Inside, the room had not been disturbed in years. A small bed, unmade, a mirror draped in fabric, a chair beside a writing desk, and above the desk, pinned neatly to the wall, were three objects: a pressed flower, a lace veil, and a photograph. Miss Marple stepped closer, The flower once red had browned, its petals curled inward like fingers recoiling. The veil was untouched, still white, still trailing like a memory caught mid-motion. And the photograph, 3 women, standing in the very garden below, all smiling. Vera, Lady Braithwaite, and a 4th, not Edith, not Eleanor, someone else, a face unfamiliar, but in the corner of the photo, handwritten, "The Rehearsal, July 1949. There had been another, not a widow, not a bride, someone erased before the story even began. She turned back toward the desk. A drawer was open. Inside, a single page, typed. Same ribbon ink as the one downstairs. You've seen enough to question her, but not enough to question yourself. And beneath it, written in pen, slanted slashing strokes, check the mirror before you leave. Miss Marple rose, the covered mirror waited. She stepped to it, unveiled it, and stared. It showed her, of course, but younger, much younger, dressed in black, standing in a church, and beside her, Eleanor Marsh, looking directly into the glass, not weeping, smiling, but not at Miss Marple, at someone just behind her, someone whose face the mirror refused to show, because some truths arrive slowly, not with the crash of revelation, but with the patient turning of a key in a lock you didn't know you'd already opened. And as she lowered the fabric over the mirror once more, the house exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. There was more to see, more to question, and just before she left the attic, something beneath her shoe clicked faintly. She bent down, a floorboard loose, beneath it, another book, small, bound in leather. She opened it. A diary, Eleanor's handwriting. 1 entry per page, until the last. They told me I imagined it. But Vera knew, and she played anyway. Miss Marple did not turn the next page. Not yet, because behind her, faintly, the house whispered, "Turn the page." Chapter 9. The veil in the fireplace. Some objects resist the years by fading gracefully. Others refuse to be forgotten. They linger, not as heirlooms or keepsakes, but as evidence. And in houses like Blackwater Hollow, evidence is rarely the kind that fits neatly into drawers or frames. It hangs, instead, like scent, faint, familiar, and just enough to unsettle. The veil above the fireplace was one such object. Miss Marple had passed it often, noting it in the same distracted manner one regards a portrait that never changes, something always there, always peripheral. But now, as morning deepened into a hush, and the house returned to pretending, she found herself before the hearth once more, this time standing still. The veil was not displayed prominently, not framed or draped with reverence. It had been tucked, almost carelessly, into the decorative scrollwork above the mantel, its fabric yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. It might have been mistaken for lace trim, a forgotten scrap from a curtain, or a discarded piece of old linen. But it wasn't. She reached for it, and it crumbled slightly beneath her touch. The scent rose faintly, rosewater, and something else. Smoke, not the fresh bite of firewood, or the comfort of an autumn hearth, but the acrid, stubborn tang of something that had burned long ago, and not meant to. Miss Marple pulled it down gently, not a mourning veil, a wedding veil, torn, charred at one edge, a faint edge of singe running diagonally across the lower half. The lacework, delicate, hand-stitched, was interrupted by scorched holes, as though the fabric had caught flame from below, and someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to smother it. And at its center, a faint embroidery, barely visible now, in the dulled thread. "Forever comes at dusk." She turned it in her hands once more, then looked up, because something in the fireplace itself had changed. There, along the inner edge of the mantel, the wood bore an inconsistency. The carvings on the right side were symmetrical, flowers, vines, repeated motifs, but the left side held one extra curl, a curl that did not belong. She pressed it, a click, soft, subtle, but the stone just above the grate shifted inward. Miss Marple bent, slid her fingers beneath the ledge, and pulled. The compartment revealed itself slowly, as if reluctant. Inside, a single envelope, yellowed, sealed with wax, cracked through the center. On the front, in looping hand, to be opened if I am no longer believed. No name, no date. But the handwriting matched what she had seen in the attic diary. She broke the seal. Inside, folded twice, and thin as breath, was a letter, written on both sides. She began to read. I have written this in the place I was told never to enter again. The study, where he sat for hours reading books he never quoted, smoking cigars that never burned down. I think he knew I was watching. I think he wanted me to. A game. Always a game. That's what they were playing. Vera most of all. She smiled at me, like I was already fading. Edith tried to warn me, once, in her own quiet way. But she was too afraid. And the lady, she pretended not to see the red marks on my wrist. Pretended not to hear what he said, behind closed doors. But I heard her. I heard all of them. I wore the veil once, just once, for a fitting. Then it vanished. And when it came back, it smelled like smoke, like rosewater poured over something burning. I knew it had been touched, altered, made a warning. I never put it on again, but they made sure I walked the aisle anyway, even if I had to be dragged down it in silence. Miss Marple turned the page carefully, her hand steady, though her heart had begun to map a new line of suspicion. I told Vera I wanted to leave. She said, that's not how it works. That once you're part of the Hollow, you don't just walk away, that the house remembers, that the walls know things. I thought she was being cruel, but now, I think she was being honest. He never wanted me. I know that now. I was meant to replace someone else who was taken, or lost. I think she's still here. I think she whispers in the mirrors. I hear things at night. My name, yes, but not just that. Laughter, pages turning, and footsteps that stop just outside my door. He said I imagined it, but he was the one who stayed in the study, long after everyone had gone to sleep. Typing things, stories, names. Miss Marple paused, because the next line was crossed out, heavily, repeatedly, and beneath it, a final paragraph began. If this letter is found, then I did not leave by choice. They will tell you I wandered, or lost myself, but I did not. I remember everything. I remember the smell, the veil, the way the fire never warmed me after that night, and if I vanish, you must ask them why they burned my. The letter ended, mid-sentence, the ink trailing downward, as if her hand had been pulled from the page before it could finish, or worse, as if she had known she would not be allowed to. Miss Marple stared at the letter, then folded it once, not tightly, just enough, and placed it back into the envelope. There were no answers in the study now, only confirmations. The real answers, she knew, were still hidden in what the others refused to speak, and those answers would not come willingly. They would have to be drawn out, carefully, because the veil had not only been burned, it had been returned, and someone had wanted her to find it. She did not go to breakfast. She waited, let the house notice her absence, let the clink of cutlery and soft conversation resume without her. Miss Marple had long learned the advantage of absence. It pulled on the threads of tension, made others wonder what you knew without ever asking. When she finally descended the stairs, it was nearly midday. She carried nothing with her, not the veil, not the letter, not the folded photograph, because evidence had no weight in rooms where memory was measured differently. The drawing room was empty, except for Vera, sitting at the window, embroidery in her lap, threading white into white. Miss Marple paused at the doorway. I once knew a woman who embroidered ghosts, she said, without preface. Vera didn't look up. Is that so? She stitched the names of people who had wronged her into flowers, daisies, forget-me-nots, rosebuds that curled just slightly too tightly. Vera pierced the fabric with her needle, and did anyone ever notice? Oh yes, Miss Marple said, though not soon enough. Vera glanced up then. There was no surprise in her eyes, only recognition. You've been in the attic, she said. I have. Found the room. Yes. The veil, yes. Vera nodded, as if some agreement had finally reached its conclusion. She was too gentle for this house, Vera said softly. She thought we would change. She thought love was enough. And was it? She never understood the vows. Not really. Here, a promise is a prison, and a wedding is not a beginning, it's a trap. Miss Marple stepped further into the room. You gave her the veil, didn't you? Vera hesitated, then smiled. That veil has never fit me. She returned to her stitching, but the thread in her hand trembled, only slightly. That night, the fire was lit, a generous one. Lady Braithwaite insisted on it. The evenings have grown too damp, she said, though no chill lingered in the house. Miss Marple sat nearest the hearth. Edith said little. Vera, even less, but the flames danced, and the mirror above the mantel caught their reflection, and once, only once, Miss Marple saw it, between flickers, a second figure beside her own. Not Vera, not Edith, just a woman in a veil, watching, then gone. When the firewood cracked sharply, no one moved, only Edith flinched. Miss Marple turned. You once said she walked the halls at night, she said to Edith. Do you still believe it? Edith glanced toward Lady Braithwaite, who said nothing, only sipped her tea. Then quietly, Edith said, I believe she never left, and Vera, without looking up, whispered, some vows are stronger than ash. Later that evening, when the others had gone to their rooms, Miss Marple remained by the fire. The flames had settled, the coals glowed softly, and behind the grate, something shifted. A soft metallic sound, like chain against stone. She leaned in, and there, just visible behind the last log, a corner of paper. She reached in carefully, pulling it free. Charred, partly burned, but not destroyed. Another letter. Or rather, the rest of one. The edges matched. It was the torn conclusion, and on it, faint, smudged by heat, only one more line survived. Why they burned my name. Miss Marple stared at the page, then at the fireplace, then slowly, at the room behind her, because it wasn't just a warning, it was a message. Someone had tried to erase Eleanor, not just from the house, but from memory, from story, from identity. But something in this house refused to forget her. And if a name had been burned, then that meant someone had feared it might still be spoken, and Miss Marple was prepared to speak it. Chapter 10. The name that was burned. There are names that mark beginnings, carved onto marriage certificates, stitched into birth records, or whispered at baptisms, and then there are names that mark endings, the kind etched in grief or silence, buried in ledgers, where no eyes are meant to wander. The one Miss Marple had found curled in the ashes did neither. It lingered, torn mid-thought, not quite absent, not yet remembered, and that made it dangerous. She sat alone in the drawing room, long after the fire had turned to ember, the final page of Eleanor's letter resting in her lap like a forgotten verdict. She read the last line again, not aloud, but in the soft rhythm of thought that marked her truest conversations. Why they burned my name. Not her dress, not her letters, not her veil, her name. She thought of the attic, of the unmarked mirror that had shown her a version of herself in mourning beside someone who never turned. She thought of the diary, the rehearsals, the photograph with its fourth woman. She thought of the veil that had been returned, not hidden, but hung, flaunted, above the fireplace, like a trophy no one acknowledged. Most of all, she thought of Vera's smile. It had never quite reached her eyes. The air in the drawing room had shifted, not in temperature, but in tone. A kind of stillness that did not invite comfort, as if the house had turned its face away, not in retreat, but in waiting. She rose, not quickly, but with purpose. The hallway was dark, though the sconces still flickered. The stairs creaked underfoot, like old men refusing to rise again. And when she reached the upper corridor, the wallpaper, once a soft floral print, seemed to swim slightly in the dim light, the petals twisting toward thorns. The longer she stared, she passed her room and turned left, toward Vera's. The door was closed, but not locked. She knocked once, waited, then entered. Vera sat at her vanity, unmoving. her hands resting lightly on a silver brush that hadn't passed through her hair in hours. In the mirror, their eyes met. "You've come to ask it," Vera said softly, not turning. "I have," Miss Marple replied. Vera's voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her. "The name she wrote, the one she says you burned." Vera didn't answer. "She didn't mean metaphorically, did she?" Miss Marple continued. "She meant it quite literally. You took a page, a certificate perhaps, or a record, and you placed it in the fire." Vera stood then, slowly, brushing her fingers along the edge of the mirror. "You assume I had the match," she said. "But what if all I did was close the grate?" Miss Marple didn't speak. "People think fire is loud," Vera continued, "but it's quiet at the beginning. It whispers, it tempts, and it never asks permission." "You knew her before the marriage," Miss Marple said. "Yes. You knew what she was walking into. I tried to stop her. You didn't try very hard." For the first time, Vera turned fully, and there was no smile now, only regret. "She didn't believe me," Vera said. "She thought love would protect her. She didn't understand that names here don't belong to the people who carry them, they belong to the house." Miss Marple stepped forward. "What was her name before it was burned?" Vera's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the weight of holding back. Then finally, she said it. "Eleanor wasn't her name." Miss Marple waited. "She changed it," Vera whispered. "To marry him, to fit. What was it?" Vera opened her mouth, but the hallway light flickered, and somewhere below, a floorboard creaked, too slowly, too deliberately. Vera stiffened. "They're listening," she said. Miss Marple turned to the door, and the rest of the house held its breath. "They're listening." Vera's words clung to the doorway, long after she'd spoken them, as though the wood itself had absorbed the warning. Miss Marple did not move, nor did she question the paranoia in Vera's eyes. After all, one does not live long among secrets without developing a sensitivity to silence, not the absence of sound, but the shape of it. And at Blackwater Hollow, silence always came wearing shoes. Vera crossed to the vanity and slid open a shallow drawer. Nestled among ivory combs and rouge tins lay a single folded handkerchief, monogrammed, not with her initials, but with a small, delicate. She handed it to Miss Marple, without explanation. "She used this before the wedding," Vera said quietly. "Said she couldn't bear to see herself cry, not on a day meant for promises." She never explained what the H stood for, but it wasn't his name. Not Henry. She used to write in her journal with it. Just the letter. Over and over, like it grounded her. Miss Marple unfolded the handkerchief. The fabric was soft, faintly stained, perhaps once with powder, perhaps with something else, something older. She was hiding something, Vera added, returning to her seat, or running from something. "I never knew which, but when she married him, she changed her name. Completely. Even the priest remarked on it. Said it was the first time he'd performed a ceremony where the bride corrected herself during the vows." Miss Marple folded the handkerchief again. "You knew she was afraid." "Yes. And you stayed silent." "I wasn't the only one." Miss Marple returned to her room and laid the handkerchief atop the desk. The fire had died there too, though the embers still hummed faintly. She sat, staring at the fabric, her mind tracing the shape of that letter, as though it might speak if she looked long enough. The name had been burned, but the person remained, and perhaps, hidden in the remnants of this house, in the books, in the letters, in the mirrors, there still lingered a piece of her that had not been erased. She turned to the shelf. The poetry book still sat there. She reopened it to the handwritten verse. "I was not the one who vanished. I was the one made to disappear." She slid the handkerchief inside, marking the page. The air shifted again. Behind her, the faintest creak. She turned sharply. No one, but the door to her wardrobe was ajar, and folded just inside, atop her suitcase, was a piece of clothing that did not belong to her, a slip. Ivory, trimmed with lace, inside the hem stitched in red thread. Hester. She held it for a long moment, and in her mind, a name began to bloom. Not Eleanor, not at all. Hester Marsh. That had been her name. Before it was changed. Before it was taken. Before it was burned. In the hallway, she found Edith, not waiting but wandering, quietly, as if she too had been drawn by the pull of a name half remembered. Hester. Miss Marple, said softly. Edith froze, then nodded. I heard her say it once, in her sleep, before she vanished. It was the only time she used that name. Why didn't you speak it? I thought I dreamed it, or that it wasn't for me to know, but it was hers. Edith looked away, and Miss Marple understood. No one had spoken it aloud since the night she disappeared. Perhaps that had been the price. To forget the truth, they had all agreed, consciously or not, to forget her name. And now that it had been spoken, something had changed. Because the house no longer felt still. It felt alerted, not in hostility, but in awareness, as if it had been waiting for someone to remember. That night, Miss Marple sat at her window with the lights off, watching the reflection of her room in the pane. At first, nothing moved, then very slowly, the mirror above her fireplace shifted in the glass, turned, just slightly, enough to show not the room, but a woman standing behind her, not Eleanor, not Vera, not Edith, someone else, watching, and just before the image faded, Miss Marple saw her lips move, no sound, but the words were clear. Now you know. Chapter 11. The Confession of the Maid. The morning broke with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a house when truths long buried begin to stir. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, the remnants of the previous night's revelations still fresh in her mind. The name Hester echoed softly, a whisper from the past refusing to be silenced. As she sipped her tea, the door creaked open, and the housemaid entered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She clutched a worn handkerchief, twisting it between her fingers. Miss Marple, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to tell you something. Something I've kept hidden for too long. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit, her gaze steady and reassuring. The maid took a deep breath, her hands trembling. They made me lie about the body. There was no fall. They'd buried him under the rose bushes. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. Who did they bury? She asked gently. The maid's eyes filled with tears. Mr. Marsh. They said he fell, but he didn't. There was an argument, and then he was gone. They told me to say he fell, to keep the police away. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to align. And Eleanor, what happened to her? The maid hesitated, her voice barely audible. She found out about the 3 widows. They weren't just friends, they shared one secret husband. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, the revelation adding a new layer to the mystery. The maid continued, her voice gaining strength. Eleanor discovered the truth, she confronted them, and then she vanished. Miss Marple sat back, the weight of the confession settling over her. The house held more secrets than she had imagined, each one darker than the last. Later that day, Miss Marple stood by the rose bushes, the maid's words echoing in her mind. With careful hands, she began to dig, the earth yielding reluctantly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, her spade struck something solid. She cleared the soil away, revealing the contours of a body. But as she brushed the dirt from the skeletal remains, a chilling realization dawned. It wasn't a man. The chapter ends here, leaving the mystery deeper than before. There are discoveries that rattle the nerves, and then there are those that redefine the past entirely. Silent confirmations of truths no one dared voice. Miss Marple did not recoil at the sight of the bones. Rather, she studied them, eyes narrowed, mind focused not on the horror of what lay beneath the soil, but on its implications. The skeletal frame was slighter than expected, the jaw narrow, the clavicle sharp and curved delicately, and though time had done its part in whitening what once held warmth, the shape, the unmistakable outline of the pelvis, told her everything. This was not the husband the maid had sworn had been buried here. It was a woman, and not just any woman, because tucked into the fabric that clung desperately to the remains, clothing long decayed, but still clutching hints of ivory lace, was a scrap of embroidery. Marple reached for it. Even after years underground, the thread still held faintly. The same red stitching, the same mark inside the slip she'd found in her wardrobe. This was Eleanor, or rather, this was Hester, the woman whose name had been burned, whose voice had been silenced, whose veil had once smelled of rosewater and fire. She had not vanished. She had been buried. And now that she'd been found, the house would no longer keep its secrets quiet. Miss Marple replaced the soil with careful hands, marking nothing. She needed no one to know just yet, not until she understood why. Inside the manor, the air had changed again. Evening was falling, but no one lit the lamps. She crossed the corridor toward the maid's quarters. The girl, Celia, was seated on the edge of her bed, clutching a worn Bible, not for faith, but for memory. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, her face pale. "It wasn't him," Miss Marple said softly. Celia's eyes filled, but she didn't ask how she knew. "You thought it was, didn't you?" Marple continued. "You were told a man was buried, but you never saw the body." "I only saw the blood," Celia whispered, "and the veil. They showed you what they needed to. Let you believe you'd helped bury the man who'd hurt her." "I didn't know," she choked. "I didn't know it was her." "They told you a story," Miss Marple said, sitting beside her. "One where you could still sleep at night. And you believed it." Celia looked down. "She was kind to me, the only one who was." Miss Marple's hand rested gently atop hers. "She left something behind," Marple said. "A letter, a handkerchief, a veil, and her name. Hester. Do you remember her ever using it?" Celia's eyes flickered. "Yes, once." She whispered it to herself. Like a prayer. That night, Miss Marple did not sleep. Instead, she returned to the study. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of paper and time. She reopened the poetry book and reread the verse, this time aloud, slowly. "I was not the one who vanished. I was the one made to disappear. You burned my name, but not my voice. Now I return, and you shall hear." A wind moved through the room, then not from the window, which remained shut, but from behind the bookshelf, a coldness, intentional. And then, the whisper again, "You found me." She turned. No one. But the mirror above the desk now held more than her reflection. In the corner, just above her shoulder, a shape formed, a woman in lace. Eyes closed, mouth parted, and then slowly, smiling. The smile of someone who had waited to be seen. Downstairs, Vera sat in the lounge, staring at the fire. "I heard something," she said, as Miss Marple entered. "I expect you did. I think she's back." "She never left," Marple replied. Vera's hand trembled. "Then, it's time," she said. "For what?" "For the others to confess." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "No," she said quietly. "Not confess. Remember. Because the truth had never really been hidden, just rewritten. And what had been buried beneath roses was not guilt, but a warning. A name erased by fire, now spoken once again, and the silence that had protected the three widows was cracking. By morning, it would fall apart completely. Chapter 12. The widow's wedding day. The hour was impossibly still, the kind of silence that followed revelation, not peace, but a pause, so deep, it felt as though the very walls of Blackwater Hollow had stopped breathing. Miss Marple, who had borne many revelations in her long life, found herself nonetheless altered by the maid's confession, the unearthing of the wrong corpse, the spoken name Eleanor, once Hester, now a figure who refused to remain buried in body, memory, or truth. And still, the house watched her. She ascended to the attic, not by chance, but by that quiet pull one feels when a secret, long dormant, begins to stir. The staircase leading up was narrow and steep, the wood beneath her feet, aged, groaning softly under the weight of inquiry. A single dangling chain swung from the low ceiling beam, and as her fingers found it, the attic door lowered like the lid of an old music box creaking open. The dust that spilled down was not merely dust, but time itself, powdered and disintegrated, waiting. The attic was cavernous, unexpectedly so. Gabled beams formed a spine overhead, like a cathedral, long forgotten. The air was thick, with the scent of old cedar, dried rose petals, and something faintly metallic, as if memory had a taste. Sunlight pierced only in lines, filtered through cobwebbed window panes, casting shadows that didn't quite behave. She found the dress quickly. It did not wait to be discovered. It presented itself. Draped carefully on a decaying mannequin near the furthest corner, it glowed faintly in the dimness, as though imbued with the remnants of its bride's longing. Yellowed lace clung stubbornly to the bodice, its details softened by time, but unmistakable in design. This had once been beautiful, perhaps even cherished. But something was wrong. There was a stain at the waist, not rust, nor wine, nor the red of crushed petals, but something darker, faded, but persistent, soaked through silk with quiet accusation. Blood. Miss Marple did not recoil, nor did she flinch. Her hands remained at her sides, her breathing even, though her mind flickered with images she could not ignore. The stain had shape, blossomed outward, like a wound just beneath the surface, and it gathered most at the seam below the bodice, right where fabric curved with a tenderness no corset could fully contain. She circled the mannequin slowly, the floorboards beneath her feet groaning their complaint. In the dim light, the back of the dress revealed more than the front had dared to. Torn ribbon, a missing button, a delicate fray along the hem, as if someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to strip it away in haste. Yet even in that disarray, it stood solemnly proud, bearing witness to a ceremony that had never reached its vow. Folded beneath the pedestal, upon which the mannequin stood, was a hatbox round, with a cracked leather hinge, and a lock that had long since surrendered to time. Inside, beneath yellowing tissue paper, lay a veil. It smelled faintly of rosewater and smoke, and it was not white, nor ivory. It was ash-stained and torn, the lace curling inward, at its edges, like parchment, scorched by candlelight. She had worn it, Eleanor, or rather Hester, had walked in that dress, beneath that veil, and the story told by the widows, the husband abroad, the widow left behind, the childless marriage, was not a story at all. It was a replacement, an erasure. She stood there for some time, perhaps minutes, perhaps more, though the light did not change, and the air remained stagnant and unyielding. Then carefully, almost ceremonially, she closed the hatbox, replaced it beneath the mannequin, and turned toward the shadows lining the eastern wall of the attic. Her eyes caught the glint of something metallic, barely poking out from behind an old trunk draped with moth-eaten linen. It was a frame, heavy and ornate. It had been covered hastily, but not well. She pulled back the cloth, revealing a portrait so meticulously painted, it seemed to watch her as she exhaled. A woman, Eleanor, draped in bridal white, her expression caught between joy and reluctance. The artist had captured her mid-turn, glancing back toward something unseen, just outside the frame. But what startled Miss Marple most was not the eyes, nor the elegance. It was the smear of red dye now, across the bottom of the canvas. It hadn't been part of the painting. And below, written in faded script, was a date. It matched the day Eleanor had vanished. She descended from the attic with her thoughts suspended, not neatly arranged in any order, but spiraling slowly around one certainty. The child had never been spoken of, the blood had never been acknowledged, and the veil had been burned but not entirely destroyed. Back in her room, the afternoon waned into the melancholy blue of early dusk. She lit a candle, not for light, but for comfort, and sat at the edge of the bed where Eleanor's final letter had once rested. There was a creak from the floorboards beyond the hall, not a settling of wood, but a step, one, then another. She rose. The door remained ajar. The candle flame trembled, not from wind, every window was sealed, but from something else. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the mirror, on the far wall, the one whose reflection had once lied to her, showing companions that weren't there. Tonight, it showed nothing at all, not the bed, not the flickering candle, not even herself. She moved forward slowly, her breath held as though a single exhale might cause the moment to shatter. The footsteps had stopped, but the hush remained, the heavy kind of quiet that one usually associates with breath being held on the other side of a door. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate. She did not open it. Instead, she turned her eyes back to the mirror, and that was when she saw it. There, in the glass, not standing in the hallway, nor outside the door, but inside the room, just behind her. A figure, dressed in the scorched veil, motionless. The lace clung to its face, concealing, not obscuring. The folds of its dress floated above the carpet, as though it neither touched the floor, nor disturbed it. Miss Marple turned. The room was empty, and yet, the scent of rosewater and smoke lingered in the air, stronger than it had ever been. She looked down. Upon her pillow, where no hand had placed it, rested a single object, smooth, gold, small enough to slip onto a delicate finger, Eleanor's wedding ring, and the whisper, this time not from the mirror, not from the walls, but from the air itself, brushed past her ear. She remembers. Chapter 13. The house remembers. It began with the book. There was no sound, no breeze, no tremor in the floorboards that might have warned her. Miss Marple had left the room only moments before, perhaps to retrieve her shawl from the parlour, perhaps because the flickering candle at her bedside had begun to tremble again. And when she returned, quiet, measured, not hasty in her steps, she found the old journal open upon the desk, the binding stretched, the spine cracked anew, and the page it had chosen to reveal, marked in red. It was Eleanor's name, not a signature, but a record. A wedding announcement, pressed between inked lines. Eleanor Hester Marsh, united in matrimony, June 14th. The date was unmistakable. It matched the painting in the attic. It matched the missing day from the house's records. It was, in short, the moment no one would acknowledge, and yet the house itself now offered it up, as if memory had grown tired of being ignored. Miss Marple closed the book, gently, but before her fingers left the worn cover, another sound interrupted the hush. A second book, this time from the library downstairs, tumbled from a shelf without force or cause. Then a third, across the corridor. One by one, throughout the manor, the bindings cracked open like mouths waiting to speak. Pages flapped like wings. The house, once still, began to move, and with the movement came the cold. Not a winter chill, not a draft from careless windows. This was older, hollower, the kind of cold that slips into bones, not through air, but through memory. It followed her from room to room. No matter where she walked, the study, the kitchen, even the sunroom, with its cracked glass and half-dead ivy, the cold remained just behind her, like breath that did not belong to her lungs. She paused before a portrait of Lord Braithwaite that had always hung at the stairwell landing. For the first time, she noticed the background. A woman barely rendered in the shadows beside his chair, a mere suggestion of a figure. She had never seen it before, not in all her previous passes. And now, the figure's eyes seemed clearer, more defined, as if the brushstrokes had deepened in the night. She turned away. By the time she reached the dining room, the chandelier was swaying. No window was open, no door had moved, and yet, there it was. She did not cry out. She simply stared, counted its rhythm, and waited. When the housemaid entered the room, her expression turned white and taut. "You feel it too, ma'am?" Miss Marple nodded once. "I'll fetch the others," the maid whispered. "It's time, I think." She meant the séance, and so it was arranged. Not at midnight, that would have felt too theatrical, but at the hour when supper ended, and the wind outside lost interest in the shutters. They sat in the drawing room, gathered not in belief but in burden, the weight of unanswered things pressing more heavily than any doctrine or doubt. Candles were lit, fingers gently clasped. No one spoke, not until the table creaked, once, and the flames fluttered inward. It was the widow Agnes who first spoke, not aloud, but in the tightening of her fingers around the circle. Her eyes remained closed, yet moisture gathered at the corners, and her lips moved silently, shaping a name perhaps, or an apology, long overdue. The table shifted again, just slightly. Miss Marple did not flinch. The air had grown dense now, and the flames had not merely dimmed, they bent sharply, as if pulled toward the center of the circle, drawn by something unseen but deeply present. A knock sounded, though no one could say from where, not the door, not the walls. Then came the whisper, It did not pass through mouths, it did not require lungs or breath. It slid along the walls, pressed against the windows, and settled beneath the furniture, like mist curling through old carpets. Vera, the name was unmistakable. One of the widows, Vera herself, opened her eyes too late. The silence after her name was not release, but accusation. The room had no warmth left, not even the candles dared to flicker now. Vera rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound too loud, too sharp. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice cracking under its own weight. "Children's tricks, the wind, the mind plays games." But no one met her gaze. She turned, not toward the door, but to the glass doors leading to the outside, where the garden met the tree line, where the fog had thickened in the past hour, and without another word, Vera stepped through, out into the dark. Her footsteps faded quickly, but inside the house, her voice did not. It echoed, not in panic, in repetition. "Vera," it said again. Only this time, it wasn't asking, it was remembering. Chapter 14. The widow who was never buried. It began with the shovel, not her own, of course. Miss Marple had no such tool in her luggage, nor the strength to wield it for long. But the groundskeeper, after much persuasion, had brought her to the edge of the rose garden near the west gate, where the grass never seemed to grow quite right, and the flowers bent too quickly in the wind. She had shown him the map she found tucked into the back of Eleanor's music journal, its edges torn, its ink faded, but legible enough to mark a cross where there had never been a grave. "I've worked this garden near 10 years, he muttered, shifting the weight of the spade. "Ain't no grave here, miss." Miss Marple merely nodded. He dug. The first few inches offered only soil and stone, root and worm. But the ground changed at 12 inches, lightened, softened. It was not fresh earth, but disturbed. The way earth settles after something has been hidden, then forgotten. He kept going. At 2 feet, something white surfaced. He stopped, brushed it gently. Fabric. She knelt, despite the cold, despite the stiffness in her knees. Her hand reached out, not to touch, but to look closer. It was lace. A veil, not scorched, not torn, like the one she had found above the hearth. This one had been buried intact, carefully folded, pressed into the soil, as if to preserve it. But no body, no bones, no casket, no ring, just the veil. A false grave. She did not speak at first. The groundskeeper, wide-eyed and fidgeting, leaned on his shovel, as if it might somehow shield him from the unease curling through the garden. But Miss Marple remained still, her eyes not on the veil, but on the empty space beneath it, the absence more telling than presence. She had seen graves exhumed before. This was no grave. This was performance. A hollow act, a memory rehearsed and rewritten. When she finally stood, her joints creaked louder than the whispering branches above. She handed the map to the groundskeeper, thanked him, and walked back toward the house alone. The wind had picked up. Inside the manor, silence met her like a wall, but it had texture now. The hush wasn't empty. It was watching, as if the air held its breath in anticipation. She took the servant stairs, up and then down again, this time toward the wine cellar, the corridor off the kitchen, that none of the widows ever spoke of. It was the youngest maid, poor Alice with her trembling hands and unfinished sentences, who had once mentioned the lower chamber. "They say it's locked," she'd whispered. "Always been, even to staff." But it wasn't locked tonight. The latch gave with a tired sigh. The door opened slowly. Stale air met her, thick with the scent of dust and something older, chalk and candle smoke, and faint rosewater, and beneath it, a scent not quite right. She stepped inside. The cellar was long and narrow, shelves sagging with bottles, whose labels had long faded, and yet, far at the end, just beneath the last sconce, a curtain hung where no window should be. She pulled it aside, and there, carved into the wall, was a false panel, ajar, as if waiting. The panel opened with a reluctant creak, as though time itself were resisting her touch. Beyond it lay a narrow stairwell, sloping downward, with uneven stone steps slick with condensation. Miss Marple took her time. The descent was not long, but it was deliberate, each footstep echoing off the stone, like a forgotten name being spoken again. At the bottom, the room widened, not grandly, but with the intimacy of something purpose-built, a room that was not meant to be found, not by guests, not by staff, perhaps not even by the other widows. The walls were bare, but one corner held a writing desk, small, crooked-legged, dust-laden, except for its center, which had been cleared by recent hands. On the desk, a single book. It was not bound in leather or cloth, but paper, ordinary, thick, and worn at the edges. Its cover was blank, but the title inside was written in a hand that trembled through time, "For the child who will never be born." Her fingers turned the pages gently. It was Eleanor's handwriting, that elegant, slanted script she had seen before, tucked into margins and notes, and the back of a photograph. But this was different. This was not a letter or diary. It was a manuscript, a story, a confession. Each page began with prose, poetic, at times, distant, and then, abruptly, blood. Halfway through, the words thickened, the ink turned darker, redder, and then, unmistakably iron-scented. It wasn't just ink anymore. She read on. "The first widow held my hand when I arrived. She said my skin was too soft for the garden. The second one served me tea with lemon. She said the roses were always redder when someone was watching. The third widow watched me walk the halls, never speaking, never blinking. She smelled of wax and dried lavender. I thought I was their guest." Miss Marple's thumb trembled as she turned the next page. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. The house knew. It whispered through the pipes. It tapped in the night, and when I told them I was with child, they said nothing. But the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. A faint sound stirred above her, footsteps perhaps, or the shifting of weight in a room that should be empty. She did not look up. "The three widows killed me, but the house loved me back." The line was underlined. Miss Marple stopped, breath slow, hand poised at the edge of the final sheet. And there, in trembling red ink, darker, wetter, fresher, was a final entry. A date, no signature. It was today's date. She dropped the manuscript, and from behind her, in the hush of the cellar, a breath that was not hers whispered in the dark. She read it. Chapter 15. The House of Three Widows. The morning came with no ceremony, no birdsong, no clatter of dishes, no creak of doors or rise of voices from the east wing. Miss Marple stood by her window and stared at a garden that no longer seemed to breathe. The mist had returned, thicker now, drawn tightly against the panes as if the house had exhaled overnight and never breathed back in. She dressed slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of certainty, certainty that something had shifted. The veil that separated this world from whatever lay beneath its surface had thinned. The house had grown quiet, but not still. The hush carried intent now. Down the hall, she passed the closed doors of the three widows, but there were no voices within, no light, no breath, no footsteps echoing behind her. The long corridor stretched like a throat sealed shut. The drawing room was empty, the parlour untouched, the kitchen colder than it should have been. No Vera, no Edith, no Mrs. Longsdale, no Clara, not even the maid. She returned to the staircase, her hand brushing the banister as though needing its assurance that she, at least, still belonged to the physical world. Halfway to the landing, her steps slowed. Her eyes shifted. There, to the edge of the study door, something had changed. A name, carved, neatly, precisely, freshly. Miss Marple, widow, not guest, not detective, widow. She did not touch the carving, not yet. To acknowledge it would be to lend it permanence, and permanence was the last thing she desired from this place. Instead, she turned the brass knob and pushed the door to the study open once more. The room had not changed, or rather, not overtly. The dust still clung to the shelves. The drapes still hung like theatre curtains, too long untouched. The typewriter remained on the desk, silent now, though it still held the same sheet of paper as before. She came back. She knows. And beside it, a book, charred at the edges. The cover, too scorched to read. Her gloved hands hovered over it, uncertain whether to turn the pages or to let it lie in its half-burned state of memory. She turned. The far wall held a mirror. No, the mirror. The one she had seen before, the one that had shown her standing not alone. And now, it awaited her again. She stepped toward it. At first, her reflection was as it should be, shoulders drawn back, hands folded, eyes alert. But then the image began to shift, not rapidly, not with distortion, but subtly, like glass, learning a secret it could no longer hide. Her dress changed. What was once a grey wool ensemble suited for rural travel had become black, jet black, lined with satin trim, the cut unmistakably bridal. A morning gown, a bridal black. In her reflection, she clutched the burned book. The reflection did not blink. Miss Marple blinked, but her mirrored self did not. Her mirrored hand tightened around the book. Her mirrored smile curved just slightly wider than comfort. Aloud. It was not malice. It was not joy. It was recognition. Miss Marple stepped back. The image did not follow. Instead, it stayed, standing in the mirror, bridal black, soot-streaked veil across its face, holding the book to its chest, like a bride clinging to a vow only she had heard. Then came the whisper, not through the walls this time, but within her ear, like a breath shared by the glass. The house doesn't want you to leave until you write the final chapter. She turned to the desk. The typewriter's ribbon, dried days ago, now gleamed slightly, moist, fresh, waiting. The paper beside it was blank. Not the burned manuscript, not Eleanor's trembling scrawl. This was new, clean, cold, unwritten. She did not sit. Not yet. She walked back to the hall. Still no sign of life, no sign of Vera, no movement from the windows. Even the trees stood still now, like sentinels carved from smoke. But one window was cracked, not broken, opened, and on the outer sill, balanced, like a gift from the wind, lay 3 objects: a wedding ring, a rose petal, and a single hairpin. Marple knew whose each had been. She gathered them without hesitation, placing each into her palm, letting their weight, or lack thereof, settle into her memory. Each token was a chapter, each woman a sentence, each silence a page unturned. Then she returned to the study. The typewriter had begun to click, alone, letter by letter, as though possessed by thought rather than hand. She approached slowly. The ribbon flickered. The paper shifted with each keystroke. 1 die o double. She removed the sheet before it finished. The machine stopped at once. Miss Marple placed it aside. Then she sat. The air grew colder, not oppressive, not cruel, just watching. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to type. Not the case, as the villagers would know it, not the facts for the local constable, but the truth, in its final form. What the house remembered, what the widows buried, what Eleanor wrote in ink and blood and veil. And as she typed, the house exhaled. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a door clicked shut. Downstairs, a clock restarted its slow tick. Outside, the trees resumed their rustle. The story had not ended, but it had been heard, and above the study door, the name remained, etched, final, understood. Miss Marple, widow. And if you've stayed with her, through the silence, through the shifting shadows, through the truth that refused to remain buried, then perhaps you too heard the house whisper. Not all stories end. Some are simply remembered. Somewhere, in the echo of an old widow's step, the creak of a library chair, or the flutter of ash, where a page once turned, something waits for the next reader. If you felt the weight of that final page, if the mirror showed you more than your reflection, then you are already part of the mystery. So stay close, subscribe, let the next whisper find you. The house may have closed its doors, but mysteries like these never truly lock behind them.